and there's a little rubber gasket that kind of keeps it in place. And what that does is if there's a loose screw in my airplane, everyone knows there's a loose screw flying it, but if there's a loose screw in it, it won't go through the engine and damage it. And, it's a $20 investment, and I guarantee you the first time that you suck up a bolt or a rock and smoke a $4,000 motor, you're going to be kind of upset with yourself for not spending the $20. So I really recommend anybody flying turbines or thinking about getting into them to run a FOD screen.
What is that, like a steel mesh or?
Yeah, it's it's almost like a little vegetable strainer type mesh material that you'd have in your kitchen.
Uh-huh.
Matter of fact, some guys actually use those little vegetable strainers. They cut the handles off of them and cut a hole in the middle, and voila, you have a FOD screen. This one here is purpose built, but I mean it's the same principle.
And you don't have any. There's no issue with the intake pulling that in.
Oh, absolutely not. Nope.
No,
no sir. Nope.
Hmm.
I haven't had an issue yet, and I've run the motor wide open, so I think it's okay.
Okay.
So with that being said, on a bypassed engine, and that I'm really going to get over everyone's head there with that, I think, or at least people who don't know. I don't run a FOD screen on an engine that's in a bypass, and we'll talk about that another day. When I have a Bandit in here, I'll show you that maybe next time.
Yep.
And the only reason I don't do that is because they typically cause the bypass to get choked, and you don't want to choke the bypass because then you got all kinds of problems. But that's a discussion for another time.
That's 102.
All right. Yeah, 102, sure. So moving along here, we'll go to this little dude. Let me get it over here. And that guy right there. I don't know. Can you see that okay, Dave? Can you see what that is?
Perfect.
That's a solenoid valve.
Yep.
And this engine system only uses one because, like I said before, we only have the one connection for fuel. So this engine uses one. Other brands and manufacturers will use two sometimes, depending. One of these for fuel and one for propane. And basically, this controls the fuel to the engine. So when that ECU says no more fuel, it closes this valve. It sends an electrical system, and that's how you shut the engine down. Basically, every shutdown on a turbine motor, you're starving it for fuel. You stop its fuel supply, you stop its heart, it's done. So
it's a one-way valve.
This is the fuel valve.
Yeah.
It's not so much a one-way valve, although fuel is only intended to go through it one way, and it actually has a little arrow on it indicating the direction of flow. I believe that when the valve is open, fuel could effectively flow both directions, although I don't know how it would or why it would. So this valve is controlled by the ECU, and in the start sequence on a propane start turbine, this valve for the fuel would remain closed. And there would be a second valve that looks just like this that has propane gas to it, and that valve would cycle rapidly open and close, putting little puffs of propane into the engine at the appropriate time. And we'll talk about the start sequence in a second. And then once the engine starts on propane and gets some EGT rising and some RPMs rising, then the engine will cut over to kerosene, and the propane will drop out, and then the engine will be running on kerosene. So basically, the engine starts on propane and then switches to kerosene once it's running on a propane start engine. On a kerosene start engine, you'll have two of these valves as well. One of them will control the main supply of fuel to the engine, and the other one will control a smaller supply of fuel to the kerosene igniter system to get the engine up and running. And then once the engine, again, is up and running, just like with the propane, this valve will close, and all the fuel will go through the main supply valve. Now, on EvoJet, we only have one of these valves, and there's another one just like this valve underneath the cowling here, this orange cowling. There's a valve inside of there, but it's all self-contained. And the reason that they did that is now all you have to do is plumb in one line, and it makes your installation on the airframe cleaner and easier. So that's propane valve, and it's got a regular JR type connector on it, just regular run-of-the-mill connector, nothing fancy, and it plugs into the engine control unit. So that's that. The heart of the system is this guy right here, and that's a fuel pump. And there's not much to it. It's just fuel in, fuel out. And then it connects to the ECU to control the RPMs, and thereby doing that, controlling the thrust of the engine. And then, of course, the brains of the situation is this guy. And they come in different shapes and different sizes for different manufacturers. EvoJet's actually a very small, compact unit. JetCat has their unit is, I'd say, probably about twice the size overall as this one. I'm not familiar with Ren, but Biotech is one that's about twice the size of this one as well. And it has, on the side, it has all the connections. You can see those there. I'm trying to get you lined up for the various things. So you can see the two green connections. One of those is out to the fuel pump, and one of those is in from the battery.
And then the telephone connection.
Here. And then there's the data terminal connection. That's correct.
Sorry, I was joking.
No. It's funny because I make custom cables for my machines all the time, and I just, I work in the telephone industry, so I just grab some cable and some connectors and pull them out. And then over here you can see servo connections and whatnot. And the front of it's, I don't know if you can read it or not, but the front of it's labeled, shows you everything you need to know. But this little dude right here is the heart of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
So this is how everything works. I'll just kind of run it down. The ECU gets a signal from the throttle channel of the radio system. And it could tell by how many milliseconds it's receiving what the position of the throttle is. So what happens, and I'll speak specifically about EvoJet because I'm most familiar with it. You have to put the system in an armed condition before it'll even start the start sequence. And the way we do that with EvoJet is the throttle is fully down. Then you raise the trim to full up trim. And when you do that, the system will acknowledge it with a sound. It'll make a beep that I'm at full up trim. Then at that point, you raise the throttle stick to max power or full throttle. The system will then acknowledge that and say, okay, with another beep, I acknowledge you're at max power. I am armed and ready to go. Then you move the throttle stick back to idle. And when you do that, the system says, okay, they want to start. We're going to start a start sequence. So now the start sequence has been engaged. The very first thing that happens is the fuel pump gives a short burst of fuel to the system, and that little electronic valve I showed you opens up. The reason it's doing that is, and this is before the engine ever rotates, moves, turns, anything. The reason they're doing that is because it's forcing fuel and oil into the engine, which, let me take a second and explain that. The way we lubricate these motors is we actually put oil in the fuel, like you would on an old two-stroke boat motor, if you guys ever had an old Evinrude motor or whatever. We mix fuel oil into the fuel. And what happens is a percentage of that fuel and oil mixture is diverted on the fuel tree to the bearings to lubricate them. So that very first burst of fuel that goes in this engine actually gets diverted to putting some oil and fuel on the bearings.
To lubricate, yeah.
To lubricate them, right, because you don't want to start the engine dry.
No.
So as soon as that happens, the starter that we talked about engages and it starts spinning the engine. And it spins the engine up. And another reason that no ignition has been put to the engine yet is because if there's any fuel that's pooled up in the bottom of it, we want to try to blow that stuff out. So the starter will kind of spool the engine up a little bit. And then at that point, it'll start to heat the glow plug. And I don't know, there's some electronic gee whiz stuff going